Lena Mercer had spent 28 years believing that loyalty meant something, but the company she'd given her best decades to would never look her in the eye and call her expendable. Instead, at 56, she got a cardboard box, a security escort to the parking lot, and the sound of Gareth Fowler's door closing behind her like a verdict. She had nothing left but the keys to her late father's rusted Airstream, sitting abandoned on a patch of overgrown land outside Harwick, Tennessee, and the words Floyd Mercer had whispered to her the week before he died. Whatever happens to you, go to the Airstream. The glove box. Don't let anyone else open it first. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The meeting had been scheduled for 9 in the morning, which should have been the first sign. Lena had been at Caldwell and Briggs Manufacturing long enough to know that HR meetings scheduled for first thing on a Tuesday meant someone wasn't coming back. She told herself she was being paranoid. 28 years. Regional Operations Director. The woman who had rebuilt the entire supply chain after the 2009 crash, who had personally negotiated the Hartfield contract that kept 200 jobs in Harwick when every other plant in the county was shutting down. They wouldn't do it to her. They did. Gareth Fowler was already seated when she walked in. He was 44, trim in a way that looked expensive, with the particular kind of confidence that came from never having worked a job where your hands got dirty. He had been brought in from corporate 18 months ago with a title nobody could quite explain, Chief Transformation Officer. And in those 18 months, he had transformed exactly one thing, the management roster. Half the people Lena had worked alongside for decades were gone. Restructured. Right-sized. The language was always clean, always careful, always designed to make a human cost sound like an accounting adjustment. She had watched it happen and told herself she was different. She had results. Numbers that didn't lie. History with this company that went back to when Gareth Fowler was still in college. The HR woman slid a folder across the table without looking up. "We're eliminating the Regional Operations Director position," Gareth said. His voice was flat, professionally neutral, coached free of any trace of discomfort. This isn't a performance issue. It's a structural realignment. Lena looked at the folder. She didn't open it. 28 years, she said. Gareth nodded, as if she'd made a reasonable observation about the weather. "Your severance package is outlined on page 2. We think it's quite fair given the circumstances." "Who's replacing me?" A pause. Small but real. "The role is being restructured," he said. "Who is doing my job starting Monday?" The HR woman finally looked up. Gareth shifted once in his chair. "Paxton Wells will be taking on an expanded operational role as part of the restructure." Paxton Wells was 31 years old. Lena had trained him, not formally, not with any title or recognition attached to the hours she'd put into it, but she had spent the better part of 2 years answering his questions, walking him through the vendor relationships she'd built over decades, explaining the reasoning behind decisions that looked arbitrary on paper but had 3 crises of history behind them. She had handed him her institutional knowledge piece by piece, and he had taken each piece, said thank you, and apparently delivered it directly to Gareth Fowler as evidence he was ready for more responsibility. She should have seen it coming. The signs had all been there. The meetings she'd gradually stopped being invited to, the quarterly reviews where her numbers were acknowledged but not celebrated, the way Gareth had started directing questions to Paxton in her presence, as if she were already slightly beside the point. She had chosen not to see it. That was on her. Lena stood, picked up the folder without signing anything, and walked out. The security guard who met her at the elevator was young enough to be her nephew. He was apologetic about it in a way that was genuine rather than rehearsed, which she appreciated even though it didn't change the situation. He waited while she cleared her desk into a box. A photo of her father standing beside the Airstream the summer Lena turned 12, her coffee mug from her first week on the job, a few folders she was entitled to keep. And then he walked her through the lobby and out into the parking lot and stood there while she loaded the box in her trunk because that was what the protocol required of him. She drove 3 blocks before pulling over. Not to cry. The crying didn't come right away. She pulled over because her hands were shaking hard enough on the steering wheel that driving felt genuinely dangerous. And Lena had always been practical above everything else. Even now, Even sitting in a parking lot outside a dry cleaner's on a Tuesday morning with a cardboard box on her back seat and no job to go to. 56 years old. No income. Health insurance running out in 30 days. A mortgage with 6 years left on it and a savings account that was reasonable but not permanently reasonable, and the specific hollow weight of a person who had organized her entire adult identity around a place that had just finished telling her she was no longer necessary. She sat there long enough for the morning to move past her window. Other people driving to work, living their ordinary Tuesday. Then she thought about Floyd. Her father had died 14 months ago, quietly, the way he'd done most things, without demanding the people around him rearrange themselves. He'd left her the land outside town. 3 acres of Tennessee grass that had gone wild in the years since he'd stopped keeping it, with his 1974 Airstream sitting at the back of it like something that had simply decided not to leave. Lena hadn't been out there since the funeral. Every time she'd thought about going, something had stopped her. Work mostly. There had always been something at work. But she could hear him now as clearly as if he were in the passenger seat beside her, his voice the same low, unhurried thing it had always been. Go to the Airstream. The glove box. Don't let anyone else open it first. She started the car. Lena Mercer had not planned on spending her career in Harwick, Tennessee. That was the thing people who'd grown up in small manufacturing towns either forgot or never admitted. That staying was usually a decision made in stages rather than all at once. Each stage feeling temporary until enough of them had stacked up that leaving stopped making practical sense. She had come back at 22 to help her father after her mother's stroke. That was supposed to be a year, maybe 2. Floyd had a landscaping business and a house that needed things done, and a wife who needed more done than either of them had fully understood before the hospital bills started arriving. Lena had taken a job at Caldwell and Briggs on the administrative side, entry level because the hours were predictable and the benefits were real, and it was the kind of company that had been in Harwick long enough to feel like it wasn't going anywhere. Her mother died after 14 months. By then, Lena had already been promoted once and was running logistics coordination for the Eastern region. She told herself she'd leave the following spring. Then she got promoted again. She was good at the work. That wasn't vanity, just fact. She had a particular mind for systems, for seeing where a process had a weakness before the weakness became a problem, for understanding that the difference between a supply chain that held and one that collapsed under pressure was usually 3 or 4 relationships managed carefully over years rather than anything that showed up neatly on a spreadsheet. Caldwell and Briggs had good people and reasonable leadership through most of the 90s, and Lena had risen steadily, each promotion carrying her deeper into the company's structure until she was so woven into how the place operated that she'd quietly stopped thinking of herself as someone who worked there and started thinking of herself as someone who was, in some meaningful way, part of what kept it standing. That distinction mattered more than she'd understood at the time. She had married briefly in her mid-30s. A civil engineer named Gary who was kind and funny and fundamentally wanted a different life than the one Lena was building in Harwick. They'd split without bitterness, stayed occasional friends, and Lena had moved into the house on Caldwell Street that she still lived in now. No children. That had been a choice that arrived gradually rather than all at once, much like staying in Harwick had. She had filled the space with work and with Floyd, who lived 20 minutes outside town and came for Sunday dinner more weeks than not, and with Nell Briggs, her closest friend since their early 30s, who ran a bookkeeping practice out her house and had the particular gift of saying hard things without making them feel like accusations. For 20 years, it had been enough. More than enough. She had built something real. The first signs that things were shifting at Caldwell and Briggs had come 3 years before the Tuesday morning in the HR office, and Lena had read them correctly from the start. She had just refused to act on what she knew, which was a different failure. The company had been acquired by a larger manufacturing group out of Atlanta. The acquisition had been announced as a partnership, described in the internal memo as an exciting opportunity for growth, and Lena had read the memo carefully and understood that a company that described things carefully in those particular terms was usually in the process of deciding which parts of its new acquisition were necessary and which weren't. She had watched other plants in the group. She knew what the pattern looked like. Gareth Fowler's arrival had confirmed it. He was brought in to make the operation leaner, And the way you made an operation leaner was by identifying the people whose salaries were highest relative to what a younger, cheaper replacement could be made to approximate. Institutional knowledge didn't appear on a balance sheet. Relationships built over decades with vendors and logistics partners didn't have a line item. The fact that Lena knew exactly why the Hartfield contract had specific clauses that looked unusual to anyone reading them cold, because she negotiated them during a period when the company's leverage was poor and she protected Caldwell and Briggs from two potentially crippling provisions. That kind of thing was invisible to someone who had arrived 18 months ago with a mandate to cut costs and no particular interest in history. She had tried, once, to make the case directly to Gareth, sat down in his office with a document she'd prepared, laying out the operational context behind decisions that looked inefficient on paper but had logic behind them that stretched back years. He had listened with the careful attention of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting politely for the other person to finish talking. He had thanked her for the context. He had done nothing with it. After that, she had known, and she had gone back to her desk and kept working anyway, kept doing the job as well as she knew how, because she didn't know what else to do with herself. Stopping felt worse than continuing. So she continued, and she watched Paxton Wells absorb everything she showed him with that quick, pleasant, slightly too eager attention, and she kept telling herself that performance would matter in the end. Performance had not mattered in the end. Driving out toward Floyd's land that Tuesday morning, Lena had turned this over in the way you turn over something that has already been examined from every angle and still doesn't resolve cleanly. She wasn't looking for an explanation. She understood what had happened. What she couldn't locate, yet was what came after it. Who she was supposed to be now that the thing she'd organized herself around for nearly 3 decades was gone. Floyd had always said she worked too hard at belonging to things that belonged to themselves. She hadn't understood that when he said it. She was starting to now. The Airstream came into view as she turned off the county road, half hidden behind a stand of cedar trees that had grown considerably taller since she'd last been here. The late morning light was flat and gray and unhelpful. She parked, sat for a moment, then got out. The land looked nothing like she remembered and exactly like it should have. 3 acres of Tennessee grass left to itself for 14 months does what grass does when nobody is watching. It grows, spreads, fills every available space with a particular confidence of something that never needed permission in the first place. The cedar trees along the property line had added a foot at least. The old wooden fence Floyd had built along the road-facing edge had lost 2 posts to rot, the wire between them sagging in a long, tired curve. Wildflowers had taken over the patch nearest the gate. Chicory, mostly tough blue things that came back every year without asking. Lena stood at the gate for a moment before opening it. She had avoided this place, and she'd known she was avoiding it, had given herself reasonable explanations each time. Too busy, not the right moment, she'd get out here soon. The truth was simpler and harder. Coming back meant Floyd was actually gone. The Airstream sitting back there behind the cedars was the last real object that held the shape of who he had been, and as long as she didn't go look at it, she didn't have to fully reckon with the fact that he wasn't coming back to it. She opened the gate. The walk to the Airstream took less than 2 minutes. It had always felt longer as a kid, when she would run ahead of Floyd through the tall grass, and he would call after her to watch for holes, his voice carrying the specific mix of amusement and genuine concern that had defined his parenting more than anything else she could name. He had been a careful man. Not cautious. Careful was different. He paid attention to things. He noticed what was actually in front of him rather than what he'd assumed would be there. The Airstream was a 1974 Ovalander, 25 feet long, silver aluminum that had oxidized in patches to a dull pewter gray. Floyd had bought it secondhand in 1988 from a retired schoolteacher who had taken it across the country twice and then decided her traveling days were finished. He had never taken it anywhere particularly far. Weekend trips, some summer weeks at a lake 2 hours east, a few long drives with Lena's mother before her health made traveling difficult. After her mother died, he had parked it on this land and kept it, maintained it, spent time in it without any particular destination in mind. It was, he had told Lena once, the place he went when he needed to think without the thinking being interrupted. She understood that now in a way she hadn't at the time. The door was on the rear-facing side, a narrow aluminum frame thing with a handle that had always required a specific technique. Lift slightly, push in, then turn. She tried it and got resistance. Tried again with more pressure. The door had swollen in the frame from weather and neglect, and it took her a full minute of working the handle at different angles before something gave way with a sound like a seal breaking, and the door swung outward. The smell that came out was closed up and metallic, with something underneath it that she couldn't name exactly. Old upholstery, maybe, and something faintly chemical that might have been whatever Floyd used to clean the countertops. Not unpleasant, just sealed away, like opening a jar that had been shut for a very long time. She stepped up and in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior was narrow and dim. The small windows filmed over with grime that filtered the daylight into something gray and diffuse. The layout was the same as she remembered. Bench seating along the left wall that converted to a bed, a small kitchenette with a 2-burner propane stove, a fold-down table, overhead cabinets Floyd had organized with the same methodical care he applied to everything. On the little shelf above the sink sat a coffee mug she recognized, a paperback with its spine broken from multiple readings, a pair of work gloves folded together. She stood there and didn't move for a moment. The cab section at the front had the 2 original driver and passenger seats, old vinyl that had cracked along the seams but held its shape. Floyd had added a thin cushion to the driver's seat at some point, attached with a strip of duct tape along the back edge in a repair so characteristically practical it made her chest tight to look at it. The glove box was between the 2 seats. A simple molded panel with a push-button latch, the kind of basic storage compartment that came standard in every vehicle of that era. Nothing about it looked significant. Nothing about it suggested it held anything different from what glove boxes usually held. Registration papers, maybe an old manual, a flashlight with dead batteries. Floyd had told her not to let anyone else open it first. He had said it the week before he died, during one of her Sunday visits, in the tone he used when he was saying something that mattered. She had nodded and half-filed it away as the kind of thing a person said near the end, a small direction, something to give the people left behind a task, a reason to go somewhere and feel close to you after you were gone. She had not thought it was literal. Standing in the dim cab now, she wasn't sure of that anymore. Her hand moved to the latch. She stopped. She needed a moment first. Needed to sit with the weight of where she was, jobless, 56, alone on 3 acres of overgrown Tennessee land, inside her dead father's Airstream, about to open a glove box he had specifically asked her to protect. She sat down in the passenger seat. The vinyl creaked under her. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar trees and the wildflowers and the sagging fence, and the Airstream sat completely still around her, holding whatever it had been holding for 14 months, patient as Floyd himself had always been. She pressed the latch. The glove box opened with a soft click and a small resistance, like something that had been shut long enough to forget how to be opened. Inside was a brown envelope, letter-sized, sealed with tape that had yellowed at the edges. Her name was written on the front in Floyd's handwriting, block letters, careful and deliberate, the way he wrote when he wanted to be legible rather than fast. Beneath the envelope sat a folded document held with a binder clip, and beneath it a small brass key on a plain ring with no label. Lena took the envelope first. She sat within her lap for a moment without opening it. The light in the cab was poor, and she thought about stepping outside where it was brighter, then decided she didn't want to. Whatever was in here, she wanted to read it in the place Floyd had left it. That felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She peeled the tape carefully, worked the envelope open, and unfolded the pages inside. It was a letter. For pages, handwritten, dated 8 days before Floyd died. Lena, if you're reading this, then you went to the Airstream like I asked you to, and I'm glad. I need you to read everything in this envelope slowly and more than once before you decide what to do with it. Promise me that at least. What I'm about to tell you, I should have told you years ago. I didn't because I convinced myself I was protecting you, and That was partly true and partly a reason I told myself, because the full truth was harder to sit with. I let something happen that I shouldn't have let happen. I stayed quiet when staying quiet had a real cost. You paid part of that cost without ever knowing you were paying it, and that's on me. I'm sorry for it. Here is what you need to know. In 1987, 2 years before Caldwell and Briggs hired you, a man named Gerald Harp was the plant operations manager there. Harp had been running the Eastern operations for 11 years. He was the one who built the systems you later inherited, the vendor relationships, the logistics structure, most of the supply chain architecture that the company ran on for decades. He was good at his job in the way that people who built things from scratch are good. Not because they followed a process, but because they understood what the process was trying to accomplish. Gerald Harp was also Floyd Mercer's closest friend for 20 years. He came to me in the spring of 1987. He'd found something, working through the plant's procurement records as part of a routine audit he'd taken on himself. A pattern of payments to a vendor called Meridian Supply Solutions. Payments that didn't correspond to any deliveries Harp could locate in the receiving logs, totaling, over a 4-year period, somewhere in the range of $340,000. He traced the vendor. Meridian Supply Solutions was a shell company, incorporated in Georgia, with a registered agent who turned out to be the brother-in-law of the company's then CFO, a man named Warren Caldwell, son of the founder. 3rd generation. Gerald brought me copies of everything. He was going to take it to the board, then to the state, if the board didn't act. He asked me to hold the copies as a safeguard in case anything happened to his own set. I said yes. 3 weeks later, Gerald Harp was fired. The company told him it was a performance issue. There was no severance. They escorted him out the same day, and within a month, they had quietly settled with him on the condition that he sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave Harwick entirely. He moved to Knoxville. We stayed in touch for a few years, and then we didn't, the way things go. I kept the copies. I put them in this glove box because I didn't know what else to do with them, and because putting them somewhere specific meant I hadn't just done nothing. I told myself I'd figure out the right move. I never figured it out. The years went by and Warren Caldwell died, and the company changed hands twice, and it started to feel like old history that had calcified past the point of maturing. But here's what I realized in these last months, Lena. Gerald Harp's systems were what you built your career on. His work was the foundation under yours. And the people who fired him for finding the truth were the same family that owned the company when you started there. Warren Caldwell's son, Douglas Caldwell, sat on the board until the Atlanta acquisition. He was the one who approved the acquisition terms. He was the one who recommended Gareth Fowler for the transformation role. I don't know if that's coincidence. I don't know if what happened to Gerald is connected to what I suspect may be coming for you. When I wrote this, you hadn't lost your job yet. But I've watched this company long enough to see the shape of what Fowler is doing, and I know what it looks like when a place decides to erase its own history. The copies are in the folded document under this letter. The key opens a lockbox at Harwick Savings on Route 9, Box 114, registered in both our names. Inside that box is a second set, plus some additional materials Gerald sent me in 2003 that I never opened. Go to the bank, read everything, then find someone who knows what to do with it. I love you. I'm sorry I waited this long to give you something useful. Dad. Lena read the letter twice. Then she sat in the cracked passenger seat of her father's Airstream for a long time, watching the light shift across the filmed-over windows, holding 4 pages of handwriting that had just rearranged the last 3 decades of her life. Outside, the cedars moved in the wind. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, picked up the brass key, and closed her hand around it. Harwick Savings on Route 9 was the kind of bank that still had a person sitting at the front door to say good morning when you walked in. Lena had driven past it 10,000 times without thinking about it. She drove past it now on her way home from the Airstream, telling herself she would go tomorrow when she had slept and eaten something and was thinking clearly. She did not sleep. She lay in her bed on Caldwell Street and stared at the ceiling and thought about Gerald Harp, a man she had never met, whose work had shaped her career in ways she'd never known to trace back to their source. She thought about the vendor payments Floyd had described, $340,000 over 4 years, no corresponding deliveries, a shell company belonging to a CFO's brother-in-law. She thought about what it meant that the person who found that had been fired within 3 weeks of finding it, escorted out, silenced with an NDA, and erased from the company's history so completely that Lena had spent 28 years working in the structure he'd built without ever once hearing his name. She thought about Gareth Fowler and Paxton Wells and the Tuesday morning HR meeting, and the folder slid across the table without eye contact. Around 2 in the morning, she got up, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with the documents from the glove box spread out in front of her. Floyd had kept everything. That was so completely him, she almost smiled at it. His particular brand of careful, the instinct to document and preserve and hold on to things that mattered even when you weren't sure yet how they mattered. The copies he'd kept from 1987 were clean despite their age, stored in a plastic sleeve inside the folded document. Procurement records, receiving logs, the vendor registration for Meridian Supply Solutions, a handwritten summary in Gerald Harp's own hand that laid out the discrepancy clearly and methodically, the way an operations man would dates, amounts, purchase order numbers, a column showing what was paid against a column showing what was received, the gap between them adding up line by line to something that could not be explained as error. Warren Caldwell's name appeared twice in the records, once as approving signatory on a payment that had no corresponding PO, once in a brief internal memo that referenced Meridian in language careful enough to be suspicious on its own. Lena read through it all twice. Then she called Nell. It was 6:45 in the morning by then, early enough that Nell answered with the voice of someone who had been awake for a while but hadn't expected the phone. "I need you to come over," Lena said. Nell came. She sat across the kitchen table and read through the documents without interrupting, which was one of the things Lena valued most about her, the ability to actually absorb something before responding to it. When she finished, she looked up and was quiet for a moment. "How long has your father had these?" "Since 1987. Nell looked at the pages again. "And Harp? You never heard of him at the company?" "Never. Not once." "So they buried him completely." "Completely." Nell sat back. She was 54, sharp-featured, with the particular directness of someone who had spent decades doing other people's books and learned that the difference between a problem and a catastrophe was usually how long you waited before addressing it. "The Douglas Caldwell connection," she said. "The board's seat through the acquisition. That's what Floyd was pointing at." "Yes." He's saying Fowler wasn't random, that the restructure was at least partly about making sure no one with long institutional memory was left in the building. Lena had been thinking about this since 2 in the morning and hadn't wanted to say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud made it something she had to act on. "That's what it looks like. You need a lawyer." "I know, not a general practice person. Someone who does employment law and understands whistleblower protections. Because if what's in these documents is what it looks like, and if your firing is connected to this in the way Floyd suspected, you're not just talking about a wrongful termination case. You're talking about something that potentially involves securities fraud, given that the acquisition was a public company transaction." Lena hadn't gotten that far in her thinking. She absorbed it. "Thad Okafor," Nell said. She said it the way she said most things, without hesitation, as if she'd already run through the alternatives and discarded them. "He moved back to Harwick 2 years ago, left a firm in Nashville. He did employment litigation for 15 years, and before that he worked in financial fraud cases. I did his quarterly books when he first opened his practice here, and we've stayed in touch. He's the right person. You think he'd take this?" Nell looked at the documents on the table. "I think you should let him decide that after he's seen what you have." Lena called Thad Okafor's office when it opened at 9. His assistant said he had a cancellation at 11:30 and could fit her in if it was urgent. Lena said it was. She spent the hour before the meeting going back through Floyd's letter one more time, reading the last paragraph slowly. The part about Gerald Harp's systems being the foundation under her own work. The part about staying quiet having a real cost. The part about being sorry he'd waited this long to give her something useful. He had waited because he thought he was protecting her. She understood that. Floyd had always tried to absorb the difficult things before they reached her, had done it her whole life with the quiet consistency of someone who considered it his job. The instinct had come from love. It had also, in this particular case, cost them both something real. But he hadn't thrown it away. He'd kept it carefully, labeled it clearly, and left her the key. She picked up the brass key from the table and put it in her coat pocket. Thad Okafor's office was on the second floor of a building on Main Street that had been a dry goods store in a previous life, and the bones of that were still visible. Wide plank floors, high ceilings, windows that let in more light than most offices got. He was 48, solidly built, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on while he worked through Floyd's documents. He read the way Nell did, without commentary, giving everything its full attention before saying anything. When he finished, he set the glasses on the desk and looked at Lena. "You haven't signed the severance agreement." "No." "Good. Don't." He picked up Gerald Harp's handwritten summary. "This is from 1987. "Yes. And your father held it for 38 years without doing anything with it." "He held it. He wrote me a letter explaining why." She slid Floyd's letter across the desk. Thad read it. His expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted. "The lockbox," he said. "I went this morning. There's a second set of copies and some materials Harp sent in 2003. I haven't gone through the 2003 materials fully yet. I brought what I could." She placed a second envelope on the desk. He opened it carefully and spread the contents out. The additional materials from 2003 were a short letter from Gerald Harp himself, a photocopied page for what appeared to be a deposition transcript, and 2 more procurement documents that hadn't been in the original set. Thad read through all of it methodically. "Harp gave a deposition," he said, half to himself. "In a civil case, it looks like. I don't know the details yet. I'll find it." He leaned back. "Here's what I can tell you right now. What's in the original documents is consistent with embezzlement through a shell vendor. That kind of scheme was harder to prosecute in the late 80s because the paper trail required was significant and the regulatory framework was thinner. Whether it was ever properly investigated, I don't know yet. What's more relevant to your situation is the connection your father drew between Douglas Caldwell's board position and Fowler's appointment. You think that holds? I think it's worth establishing. Caldwell sat on the board through the acquisition. He had a documented interest in making sure the company's pre-acquisition history stayed buried. If Fowler was specifically tasked with clearing out long-tenured employees who might have institutional knowledge, and your profile fits that category perfectly, then your termination isn't just wrongful dismissal. It's potentially retaliatory, which opens a different set of options. Lena sat with that. What do those options look like? Thad put the glasses back on and looked at the documents. The strongest move isn't a lawsuit. Not first, anyway. The strongest move is going directly to the company's current board with what you have, formally and in writing, before you file anything. You give them the opportunity to respond. It creates a paper trail, and it puts them in the position of having to either acknowledge what happened or go on record denying something they can't fully deny. And if they don't respond, then you file, and you have a documented record of them choosing not to. He looked at her steadily. "I want to be honest with you about the timeline. This is not a fast process. Depending on how the company responds, this could take months. What won't be is quiet." Lena had known that since the Airstream. "I'm not looking for quiet." Thad nodded once. "Then let's talk about what the formal letter looks like." They filed the letter 3 weeks later, sent by certified mail to the full board of the Atlanta parent company with Thad's firm as the return address. It laid out the original procurement fraud, the termination of Gerald Harp, Douglas Caldwell's connection to both the original incident and the acquisition, and the circumstances of Lena's dismissal. It requested a formal response within 14 days and noted that absent a satisfactory response, the matter would be referred to the Tennessee Department of Labor and the SEC. The response came in 11 days. A letter from the company's outside counsel, bland and careful, stating that the company took the allegations seriously and was conducting an internal review. Thad read it and called Lena. "They're stalling." "I know. We file Monday." The filing was not quiet. Thad had anticipated that, but the speed of it surprised even him. By Tuesday afternoon, a reporter from the Harwick Courier had called Lena's number, and by Wednesday the story had been picked up by a Nashville business publication that ran it under a headline about procurement fraud and corporate cover-ups at a regional manufacturer. The framing was accurate enough that Lena didn't wince at it, which was more than she'd expected. Gareth Fowler issued a statement through the company's PR firm, calling the allegations without merit and reiterating that Lena's termination had been a structural decision with no connection to the claims being made. The statement was 3 paragraphs of careful language that said nothing concrete, which was its own kind of answer. Paxton Wells said nothing publicly. Lena heard through a former colleague that he had gone very quiet since the story broke, had stopped attending the internal leadership meetings Gareth had been running, had taken 2 unscheduled personal days. She didn't spend much time thinking about Paxton. He had made his choices, and they were his to carry. What stayed with her was Gerald Harp. She had found him through Thad, still alive, living in Knoxville at 79, in reasonably good health. Thad had reached out through a letter. Harp had called back within 2 days, his voice on the phone steady and dry, and carrying the particular tone of a man who had waited a very long time for something and had stopped being surprised that it was finally happening. "Your father kept everything," he said. "He did," Lena said. A pause. "He was a good man." "Yes," she said. "He was." The company settled 4 months after the filing. Thad called Lena on a Thursday morning in late autumn, when the trees along Caldwell Street had gone fully orange and were starting to drop. He said the number they'd offered, and she was quiet for a moment, doing the math in her head the way she always did with figures, checking it against what she needed rather than what felt satisfying. It was enough. More than enough. Enough to pay off the mortgage outright, cover the next decade without working if she was careful, and still have something left over that felt like options rather than survival. "There's a condition," Thad said. "There's always a condition. They want a non-disclosure on the settlement amount. Not on the underlying facts. Those are already public. Just the number." Lena thought about Gerald Harp, who had signed an NDA 38 years ago and moved to Knoxville and lost 28 years of a career he'd built from scratch. "What happens if I say no? They'll likely come back with a lower number and try again. Or we go to trial, which takes another year at minimum and costs you more in legal fees. Though with your case, the contingency arrangement covers most of that risk. What do you recommend?" Thad was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was giving you his actual opinion rather than the professionally cautious version. "Take it. The facts are already out. The story has been reported. Douglas Caldwell resigned from the board last month. The amount is a number. It doesn't change what happened or what's now on public record." She took it. Douglas Caldwell's resignation had come 6 weeks after the filing, announced through a terse company statement that cited a desire to focus on personal matters. The Nashville business publication ran a follow-up piece connecting his departure directly to the allegations in Lena's case. 2 board members who had been appointed during the period Caldwell was most active also stepped down within the same month, quietly, without statements of any kind. Gareth Fowler lasted another 3 weeks after Caldwell. His departure was announced as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities, which was the corporate language for something that had stopped being mutual some time before it was announced. The company named an interim operations head and issued a broader statement acknowledging that a historical review of procurement practices had identified irregularities that were being addressed. It was careful language. It stopped well short of the direct admission Lena had wanted. But Thad had told her early on that direct admissions were rare, that what you usually got instead was a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who knew they were wrong. The resignations, the settlements, the careful statements that went right up to the edge of acknowledgement without crossing it. That pattern was visible to anyone paying attention, and by now enough people were paying attention that the shape of it was clear. Paxton Wells was not fired. That had been one of the harder things to accept. He had been the instrument of a good portion of what happened to Lena, had absorbed her knowledge and her relationships, and positioned himself as her replacement, and the company had kept him on in a reduced role that was described internally, according to her former colleague, as a lateral move. Lena thought about that for a while. The injustice of it was real, and she sat with it long enough to understand it wasn't going away. Then she set it down, not because it didn't matter, but because continuing to carry it was a weight she was choosing, and she was done choosing weights she didn't have to carry. What she hadn't anticipated was Gerald Harp. After Thad's initial contact, Harp had become part of the case in a limited way, providing a written statement about his original findings and his termination that Thad had used to support the filing. He hadn't needed to do more than that, could have stayed in Knoxville and let the documents speak for themselves. Instead, he had driven to Harwick on a Tuesday in October, a 79-year-old man making a 3-hour drive alone to sit in Thad's conference room and give a formal recorded statement about what he had found in 1987 and what had been done to him for finding it. Lena had been in the room. He was a compact, deliberate man with white hair and the specific physical bearing of someone who had done manual work for decades before his body made him stop. He had looked at the procurement copies, his own copies from 38 years ago, kept by Floyd Mercer in a glove box in a rusted Airstream on 3 acres of Tennessee grass, and his expression had moved through something she couldn't name precisely. Not relief, exactly. Something older and quieter than relief. After the statement was finished and the recorder was off, he had turned to Lena and said, "Your father called me once. Maybe 2005. Just to say he still had everything and he was sorry he hadn't done more with it." Lena hadn't known that. "I told him keeping it was enough," Harp said. "At the time I meant it as something polite to say." Turns out it was actually true. She had driven home from that meeting along Route 9, past the Harwick savings where the lockbox was now empty, past the county road that led out to Floyd's land, past the grain elevator and the hardware store, and the parking lot of Caldwell and Briggs where she had pulled over 4 months ago with shaking hands. The town looked the same as it always had. Towns mostly did, regardless of what happened inside them. She thought about Floyd sitting in the Airstream on evenings she'd been too busy to visit, holding on to 38 years of someone else's truth because throwing it away had never felt like something he could do. She thought about what that kind of patience cost a person. She thought about what it was worth. The first thing Lena did with the settlement money, before the mortgage, before anything practical, was have the Airstream restored. She found a man in Cookeville who specialized in vintage aluminum trailers, a retired mechanic named Burris who had been doing this work for 30 years and talked about Airstreams the way some people talked about old houses, as things that had been built to last and deserved to be treated accordingly. She drove out to his shop with photographs, and he walked around them slowly, asking questions about the year and the model and what she wanted the end result to be. "Do you want it to look new?" he asked. "Or do you want it to look like what it is?" "What it is," she said, without hesitating. He understood that. The restoration took 11 weeks. He repaired the aluminum skin where it had stress cracked, replaced the seals around the windows, rebuilt the interior without erasing the evidence of its age. The worn patch on the bench seat where Floyd had sat, the small repair on the cabinet door where a hinge had been replaced years ago with a slightly different hinge, because that was what the hardware store had in stock that day. The coffee mug stayed on the shelf above the sink. The broken spine paperback stayed where it was. When Burris was finished, he called her, and she drove out to see it. The Airstream sat in his lot in the November light, solid and clean, no longer neglected, but not falsified either. Still itself, just maintained. She wrote the check on the spot. She paid off the mortgage the following week and took Nell to dinner at a restaurant in Nashville they had talked about going to for 3 years without ever making the reservation. They drove up on a Friday, stayed overnight at a hotel, ate well, drank 1 glass of wine each, and walked around the city for 2 hours in the cold before driving back Saturday morning. On the drive home, Nell said, "What are you going to do now?" "With the work, I mean." Lena had been thinking about this in the background for weeks without arriving anywhere definitive. "I don't know yet." "That's fine. Is it? You spent 28 years knowing exactly what you were doing every day. Not knowing for a while seems proportionate." That was Nell's gift, the ability to make the reasonable thing sound reasonable rather than making it sound like something you had to be convinced of. What Lena did know was that she wasn't going back to manufacturing. The work itself she didn't hate. The systems thinking, the operational logic, the particular satisfaction of a supply chain that held under pressure because someone had anticipated the right things. But the version of that work that was available to a 56-year-old woman with her profile, in her industry, at a moment when her last employer had become publicly associated with procurement fraud and board-level resignations, was not a version she was interested in pursuing. The door wasn't fully closed. She just had no desire to open it. What she found herself doing instead, in the weeks after the settlement, was talking to people. Gerald Harp, mostly. They had fallen into a pattern of phone calls every week or two, his voice dry and careful on the line from Knoxville. The two of them working through the specifics of what had happened in 1987 and what had happened since, and what the distance between those 2 points felt like from inside it. He had spent 38 years carrying the version of events where he had found the truth, and the truth had cost him everything. And now the shape of that story had changed. He was still working out what to do with a new shape. Lena understood that. She was working out too. She moved the Airstream to a spot near the tree line on Floyd's property, level ground with a good view of the field. She had power run out to it, got the water connected, made it livable in a genuine rather than provisional way. She wasn't living in it. She kept the house on Caldwell Street, but she spent time there most days, in the mornings before the day started or in the evenings when the light went low and golden over the overgrown field. She brought a second chair and put it beside the driver's seat in the cab. The brass key she kept on her kitchen counter. She had considered putting it somewhere more deliberate, a drawer, a box, somewhere organized. But she liked seeing it there when she made coffee in the mornings. It reminded her of the particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself, that shows up instead as 38 years of careful preservation and a letter left in a glove box in faith that the right person would find it at the right moment. Floyd had not been certain she would need it. He had simply made sure it would be there if she did. She thought often about the version of her life where she had signed the severance agreement before going to the Airstream, where she had taken the folder from the HR table and signed it that same Tuesday morning with the efficient practicality she'd applied to most things. She would never have gone to the Airstream with any urgency. Might have gone eventually, out of duty or grief, but not with the specific desperation that had put her hand on that glove box latch. She thought about what stays buried when nothing forces it to the surface. How much truth sits in glove boxes and locked rooms and letters never sent, waiting for a moment of necessity that never quite arrives. She had been fired at 56 with nothing but a cardboard box and a dead man's instructions. She had lost the career she'd built her identity around, been replaced by someone she'd trained, walked out of a building she'd given 3 decades to with a security guard making sure she actually left. And at the back of 3 acres of overgrown Tennessee grass, in a rusted Airstream her father had maintained with the same quiet faithfulness he'd applied to everything that mattered. The truth had been waiting for her with complete patience. She had found it. She had done something with it. She was still here. That was enough. On most days, it was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.